Hey kids, Flexing Teacher Weber here. It's Friday night, the night before Halloween. I hope you're having a nice evening. We had a great week at school, and I hope you're going to have a nice weekend. I thought I'd take some time to review some of the work we have done so far this week. Now, we started out the week looking at equivalent fractions, and we did a couple of assignments where we focused on solving some equivalent fraction number puzzles where we had an unknown number. And then we took that idea of equivalent fractions and started a little activity where we drew a rectangle, and we wanted to represent the fractions in this rectangle in a couple ways using equivalent fractions, and we discovered something. So what we did in this activity is we took a rectangle, we drew it in our notebook, and we wanted to represent 1/4 of that rectangle. So we took our pencils, and I told the kids to divide the rectangle in half, and to divide each of the halves into halves, and you can get 4 equal parts, and then they shaded in 1 out of 4. And then asked them to think a little differently, like turn their head sort of sideways, and with a different color, divide this rectangle into thirds, like so. And then I asked them to shade in 1/3 in a different color, so I shaded in 1/3 in red. You can see going the other way, I guess going horizontally, that this is 1/3, 2/3, 3/3, right? So then what I asked them is, how many mini squares is this rectangle divided into? And it's divided into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 equal squares. And those 12 squares, that is an important number. That 12 is called the lowest common denominator. So it's divided into 12 squares, and that number is called the lowest common denominator of those two fractions, or the LCD. It's the lowest common denominator of 1/3 and 1/4. And that lowest common denominator represents the smallest denominator where we can still represent a fraction of 1/3 and 1/4 on. And when we can represent those fractions with the same denominator, we can add them and compare them, and it makes everything with the fractions much easier. So we decided to represent those fractions both with the denominator of 12. So we made some of these number puzzles with the denominator of 12. 1/3 equals something with denominator 12, and 1/4 equals something with denominator 12. So what we did is we had done this earlier in the week. To go from 3 to 12, we multiply by 4. Do the same thing to the top, and that's 4 over 12. And if you look at the, I'll flip back to the picture here. If you look at the fraction 1/3, right here, this fraction 1/3 represents, if we think about the long rectangles, it represents 1/3 of the entire rectangle, but it also represents, if we think of the smaller squares, 1, 2, 3, 4 out of 12. So that's how this represents an equivalent fraction. And then over here, the fraction 1/4, we get that, go from 4 to 12 by multiply by 3 and do the same thing to the top, and that's 3 out of 12. So if we go back to the picture, 1/4 is represented by the blue. If we think of the longer rectangle, this blue part represents 1/4 of the rectangle. But if we think of the smaller squares, it also represents 1, 2, 3 out of 12. So those are both equivalent fractions. So when we have fractions written as equivalent fractions, we can see now, well, okay, 4 over 12 is greater than 3 over 12, which means 1/3 must be greater than 1/4. So it makes it easier to compare the fractions and all kinds of different things. So that's our focus right now, is finding a lowest common denominator of fractions. So that's what I had the kids do, finding lowest common denominator of fractions. And then what we also did is we moved from pictures to the numbers. We can also use multiples to find the lowest common denominator of 1/3 and 1/4. So what I had the kids do is think back to grade 6 and start skip counting and listing multiples of 3 and 4. So first few multiples of 3 are 3, 6, 9. First few multiples of 4 are 4, 8, 12. And we want to go until we get 1 in common. And when I skip count one more by 3, I get that lowest common denominator of 12. So we definitely don't have to draw a picture every time, but I just wanted to show what that type of thing looks like. So we would say that the lowest common denominator, the LCD of 3 and 4, is 12. And then what we did is I had them do this again with the picture, just one more time. So I said find the lowest common denominator for 2 over 3 and 1/2 in 2 ways. So they drew another rectangle and they divided it in thirds one way and half the other way. So I'll start with thirds and doing a little estimating of the size. Okay, and then shading in 2/3. So I'll shade that in blue. 1, 2. And then changing my color and thinking of it the other way, I divided this in half. And I shaded in 1/2 in red. You can see now I have this rectangle divided into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 smaller rectangles. And then I ask these questions again. Based on the picture, the lowest common denominator of 2 and 3, well, that's the number of rectangles that this rectangle is divided into. So the lowest common denominator is 6. And then I said, using the picture, what is an equivalent fraction to 1/2 and 2/3? Well, look at this. 1/2, which is represented by the red part. If you think of the long rectangle, 1/2 is also 1, 2, 3 out of 6. And if you think of 2/3, okay, 2/3 is the blue part. So the longer rectangles are 2/3. There's blue parts, so 1/3, 2/3. But you can also think of 2/3 as 1, 2, 3, 4 out of 6. Okay? So I had them use the picture to find those equivalent fractions, but then we also went to the numbers. Find the lowest common denominator of 2 and 3, 2/3 and 1/2 using the multiples method. So we skip counted by 2's, 2, 4, 6, 8. Do a few with 3, 3, 6, 9. But we don't have to go any further because we can see by skip counting the first multiple they have in common is the lowest common denominator. So we'd say, the LCD is equal to 6. And then we already know the equivalent fractions from the picture, but if we use the numbers to get equivalent fractions, so if we want to write both fractions with denominator 6, we can use number puzzles for that as well, right? Well, you know what, I'll do that in blue. So if we want to write both fractions with denominator 6, we'd say, okay, well, 3 times 2 is 6, and 2 times 2 is 4 out of 6. And then with the fraction 1/2, we know from the picture it's going to be 3 out of 6, but if we want to use the numbers as well, we know 2 times 3 gives us 6, so 1 times 3 gives us 3 out of 6. And we knew that from the pictures. And that's going to be our goal, is to move into not moving away from the pictures and just using numbers to get the lowest common denominator. Last thing we did is I had them take a set of fractions and find the lowest common denominator for each set using the multiples method, and then write each fraction with an equivalent. So what we did here is we had the fractions 2/3 and 4/5. Okay, and to get the lowest common denominator of 3 and 5, I take my denominators, 3 and 5, and I do some skip counting. 3, 6, 9, 5, 10, 15. Keep going till we get one in common. Okay, do a few more with the 3, 12, 15. There we go. Lowest common denominator of 3 and 5 is 15. and we would call that the LCD is 15. And then what we did is we wrote both fractions with an equivalent fraction out of 15. So to go from 3 to 15, it's times 5. Do the same thing to the top, and 2 times 5 is 10. And to go from 5 to 15, it's times 3. And 4 times 3 is 12. And there we have our equivalent fractions for 2/3 and 4/5. And then it helps you picture things easier. I now know 4/5 has to be bigger than 2/3 because the equivalent 12 over 15 is larger than 10 over 15. And then the last one we did is one we corrected today. I'd given this one for homework. I asked them to find the lowest common denominator of the fractions 5 over 6 and 4 over 9. So to do that, you take denominator 6 and denominator 9, and you do some skip counting. 6, 12, 18, 9, 18. Oh, look at that. Lowest common denominator of 6 and 9 is 18. So I do LCD equals 18. And then the last thing I had them do was write both fractions with the denominator 18. Well, I know to go from 6 to 18, it's times 3. So I do the same thing to the top, and 5 times 3 is 15. To go from 9 to 18, it's times 2. Same thing to the top, it's 8 out of 18. And now we have 2 equivalent fractions. So if the kids can do this kind of stuff, then our next thing, we started it just a little bit today, and we'll continue it next week. We can do a lot of adding and subtracting of fractions with any denominator because we can find lowest common denominators and then add and subtract fractions and do all kinds of things with them. Now, there was no assignment today, but when we do adding and subtracting fractions, we'll be practicing a lot of this stuff, finding a lowest common denominator and doing all those sorts of things. So if the kids don't quite get it yet, we're going to be doing plenty of practice with this on into next week. I hope you have a great weekend. I hope this video helped. That's all for now. Trust me, I'm flexing. Flexing Teacher Weber out.